Hi there, my name is Stephen Mawhinney and I'm the pastor of the Adullam Church that meets here in the Dublin 6 West area. And once again, it's great to be with you, and once again, thanks to you who tune in regularly and listen and watch, these Bible studies that are coming out from the church. Some of you are aware, if you've been following us, the last 2 weeks, we've just been looking at a few lessons from this wonderful Psalm 107. And we've looked so far at two groups of people. The first group of people mentioned in the Psalm were a group of people who, for whatever reason or reasons, were lost in the desert. And then in our following study, we looked at another group of people who, for whatever reason or reasons, were locked in a dungeon. And today we're going to look at a third group of individuals who we are told were lying on a deathbed. So I just want to read a few verses again from Psalm 107, and today we're taking up from verse 17. So it's Psalm 107 and verse 17. And it says this: Some became fools through their rebellious ways, and suffered affliction because of their iniquities. They loathed all food and drew near the gates of death. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He sent out his word and healed them. He rescued them from the grave. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. Again, it's a lovely few verses, isn't it? As I said earlier in one of the previous messages, I just love this psalm and the lessons that we can learn from it. And this week we're looking at a group of individuals who we are told are literally at the point of death. They are lying on their deathbeds. So the first thing we see is their plight. That's their plight. That's their problem. They are lying on their deathbeds. Psalm 107, verse 17 says this. It says, Some because fools through their rebellious ways and suffered affliction because of their iniquities, they loathed all food and drew near the gates of death. And you'll agree with me when I say that's fairly serious. You can't get much worse than that. In other words, because of their sin, this was their problem, this was their plight, because of their rebellious ways. And, we're not left wondering or what our imagination tells us brought them to this place. Scripture, and we just read it, tells us because of their sin, because of their rebellious ways, they had brought themselves to this place. God hadn't brought them to this place to the point that they were near to death. They had brought themselves to this point that they were on the verge of dying. The Grim Reaper, as we sometimes use that expression here, don't we? The Grim Reaper, or the angel of death, was hovering over them like a vulture. Their constant sin, they had wearied themselves with sinning. Their constant sin had weakened their bodies and their minds to the point that they were now unwilling and or able to even eat food. They loathed food, the very thing that would keep them alive, the very sustenance they needed, the very thing to keep them from dying, food, nutrition. They loathed it. They were that sick that they actually couldn't even touch food. And we all know, don't we, or some of us know, that's what sin and serious degrees of sin can do to an individual, to certain individuals, who, despite numerous warnings and despite persistent warnings, they persist in a particular sin or sins, and they persist in a particular habit. For example, the drug addict, the alcoholic, who refuses every offer of help. The addict or the alcoholic, though they are in a terrible state, who still refuses medical assistance, spiritual assistance, who refuses to go into hospital, who refuses to go into a rehab, who spurns every offer of help and assistance. Often that will happen. They get weaker and weaker and weaker, and sadly, they often die. Some of you know that Margaret and I, for a number of years, about 20 years, the Lord many years ago gave us a tremendous burden to help those who were afflicted by alcoholism and drug addiction. And for a number of years, we had many men who stayed in our home for different periods of time. And some of those individuals, some of those individuals, not all, but some of them, despite persistent warnings to, cease. This is after they would have left our home and for whatever reason or reasons, relapsed and went back on the drugs and or the alcohol, despite serious attempts to help them and assist them. Sadly, a number of those individuals died. I can remember one particular lad, a lad by the name of Alan, and he stayed with us for, goodness, it must have been the best part of 2 years. We grew to love him very, very much, became a very close and personal friend to both Margaret and I, and he left us after a long period of time, and he was doing extremely well for a long period of time. And I remember getting a phone call one day. Margaret and I were travelling up from a Christian conference down in Cork, and we were returning up to Dublin, and we got a phone call to tell us that Alan was dead. He had been found in the flat where he was living on the north side of the city. He'd been found sitting up in a chair with an open Bible on his lap, but he had died from a drug overdose. And it was so sad because part of his testimony was I would have brought Alan with me to certain meetings to share his testimony, and his testimony was that the Lord had rescued him on numerous occasions and had saved him. He should have died on numerous occasions, and the Lord told him on one occasion, whatever, could have been the 7th or the 8th time that the Lord had spared his life. And he shared this with the people. This isn't my words, Alan. And he said, the Lord told me that I ever went back on drugs, if I ever went back on heroin again, that the Lord would call me home. And he shared that in many places. And sadly, for Alan, the Lord remained true to his word. It was a heroin overdose, and he was dead, never to return. He had gone down to skin and bone. I remember another lad, the very same thing applied, and Margaret and I found him dead. Another man from the Cork area, Jeremiah, and I found Jeremiah dead in one of the bedrooms in our home, in a purpose-built extension that we had. And he had been clean for a long, long period of time. But sadly, for whatever reason or reasons, he had relapsed, and I found him dead. And Jeremiah, of course, will never return. I can think of many, many, many more. A brother-in-law of my wife, Margaret's, he was a very, very good mechanic. He was a fine, big, tall man, but because of his alcohol addiction, he lost everything. His marriage, his job, his work, many of his friends, everything. And this man, who was a fine, big man, went down to 8 stone in weight. And the last few weeks of his life, he loathed all food. He couldn't eat food. All he could do was suck Guinness through a straw. Reduced to 8 stone, and then found dead. All of these individuals, and there were women also, they just deteriorated, and for whatever reason or reasons, they refused to cry out to the Lord. They refused help, and sadly, they died. They went through it, and they never ever returned. Verse 18 says, they loathed all food and drew near the gates of death. And sadly, many of these individuals went through the gates of death. And again, and sometimes, I'm going to be honest, I get tired I get tired at times of speaking of myself. But again, during my 20 years of backsliding, there was many times where I was seriously, and I mean seriously ill, where I was hospitalized on numerous occasions. One occasion I was hospitalized for a period of nearly 6 months continuous, and I was unable to walk for a number of those months. And it was all brought on by my lifestyle. It got to the point where there was times where I just loathed all food. I can remember a particular time in my life when I was perhaps at my worst with my addictions, and I was surviving sometimes just on dry cornflakes, not even any milk to go with them. Dry cornflakes, that's all I could afford. I could buy an old box of cornflakes, cheap yellow pack, that would keep me going for the week. And once I had money for alcohol and whatever else I was doing, and I was a physical and I was an emotional wreck. Like the individuals in this psalm that we are looking at today, I had come very near, so near to the gates of death. There are at least 4 occasions that I can remember very clearly where I was at the verge of death and when the Lord rescued me. I can remember one occasion when my heart stopped when they were doing some tests in the Mater Hospital in Dublin. And I can just remember suddenly everything going black. And when I came around, I was surrounded by doctors and nurses. And they'd been sitting in, the room they watch all the heart monitors, and mine, it just suddenly went straight. I was gone. And I thank God, and it's obvious to see that they resuscitated me. There were other things, there were car crashes where I should have died, all because of my lifestyle and my rebellious ways. That was, like these individuals, that was my plight and that was my problem. But now we come to their prayer. We see what their plight was. They had drawn near to the gates of death because of their rebellious ways, because of their lifestyles, because they weren't looking after themselves physically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally. But then we read in verse 19, it says very clearly, then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. And here again we have the cry of the sick, the cry of the sick. They were sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I want to ask you a question today, and the question is this: have you ever personally felt like that? Have you ever felt like that? Can you relate to some of these individuals that we are looking at today? You're walking around you're getting up, you're doing your thing, you're doing what you have to do, but inside, deep within your heart, your mind, you feel as though you were lying on your deathbed. You feel inside, even though you're walking around, you're getting up in the morning, you're fulfilling the tasks that you have to do, but inside you feel as though you were languishing in a disease. Well, I want to suggest to you today, and I want you to understand this very clearly so that you don't take me up wrong. It could, I'm not saying it is, it could be very well, it could be the fact that your own sin has brought you to that place because of your lifestyle, because you are not looking after yourself physically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally. You have neglected all of those areas. You are not living healthily in any of those areas. You see, God's word never lies. It's always truthful. And verse 17 tells us here in Psalm 107, it says, some became fools through their rebellious ways and suffered afflictions because of their iniquities. Suffered affliction because of their iniquities, because of their sins. They loathed all food and drew near the gates of death. Now, it's very important that we get this right. And there's some weird and wacky and bizarre stuff being taught about this whole subject of healing. So it's very important that we understand this. And it's very important that we remember and keep it in our hearts and minds and spirits that not all, and I stress, not some is, but not all sickness is the result of sin in someone's life. Some is, but not all. And to support that, I just want to share a few verses with you. Firstly, in John chapter 9, Gospel of John chapter 9. And I encourage you to check this out for yourself. And a little heading in my Bible above it that says, Jesus heals a man born blind. So John chapter 9 and verse 1 says this. As he went along, meaning Jesus, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man, meaning the blind man, or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Now, I find this extremely interesting. This man is born blind. He came straight from his mother's womb, blind. As a newborn baby, we've been blessed at the moment. Our beautiful grandson is 4 months old. We have a beautiful granddaughter, 2 years old. Yes, the terrible twos, as some of you know who have going through the terrible twos. She's an absolute hoot. Very much like her mother, she has our daughter Ruth has she has a mind of her own. Beautiful girl. And both of those were born with their full sight. This young man that we're looking at here, he came straight from his mother's womb blind. And the teaching was, or the thought was, by some in those days, well, for that to have happened, he must have been going to lead a sinful life, or his parents must have done something. There must have been sin in either one or two of the parents that this child was born blind. And Jesus says nothing could be further from the truth. It's Jesus's words. It's not mine. And the reason I'm saying that, there's a teaching going round, as we all know. Some of us know that all sickness is a result of sin or lack of faith. Well, friends, that's not true. Nothing could be further from the truth. That's just someone's teaching. Scripture doesn't teach that. Here is a man born blind, and the disciples asked Jesus, who sinned, Lord, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? How can a newborn baby sin? Those of us who've had our own children, and he just came straight from the womb. He hasn't even taken a breath outside of his mother's womb, and he's blind. Of course he didn't sin. And Jesus says, neither this man, the blind man, nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. In other words, Jesus was going to heal this man so that his glory and his works might be displayed in and through this blind man. I want you to turn me, or Google it, to another verse in Galatians. And it's in Galatians, it's in Philippians chapter 2. Sorry, I need to get comfortable in my chair. I'm getting a bit, in the right sense. Philippians chapter 2. And this is Paul. And Paul is writing to the church in Philippi. They're Christians, okay? They're Christians just like you and me. And Paul says this in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 25. He says this, Philippians 2 verse 25. But I think, he says, it is necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus, my brother, co-worker and fellow soldier, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. For he longs for all of you and is distressed because you heard he was ill. Indeed, he was ill and almost died. But God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but also on me, to spare me sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore I am all the more eager to send him, so that when you see him again, you may be glad and I may have less anxiety. Then he says in verse 30, because he almost died for the work of Christ. He risked his life to make up for the help you yourselves could not give me. So here we have this man Epaphroditus, and here we have Paul. And I would imagine, in fact I'm positive, that next to Jesus, the greatest individual Christian that ever lived was the Apostle Paul. Paul raised people from the dead. From the dead. And you've heard me say it before, you can't be any deader than dead. Paul healed every type of sickness and illness. Paul was an incredible preacher, church planter, healer, raiser of the dead. And yet he talks about this man Epaphroditus, one of his closest friends, an amazing Christian, an extremely godly man filled with the Spirit. And Paul tells us that he nearly died. Are we going to say that there was some sin or some lack of faith in this man's life, Epaphroditus? Would we dare even to suggest, we who are unworthy, to tie this man's laces? Are we going to dare to suggest that it was sin or a lack of faith that he nearly died? No, nothing could be further from the truth. Paul again says in 1 Timothy chapter 5, and I'll read it out just in case you think that I am making it up, which of course I'm not. But Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 5, he says this in verse 23, 1 Timothy 5 verse 23. And Paul is talking to Timothy. He says, Timothy, stop drinking only water and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. Your frequent. Timothy was obviously feeling sick quite a lot of the time. Timothy, Paul was Timothy's mentor. Paul was Timothy's father figure. Paul was teaching Timothy, instructing Timothy, discipling Timothy. Why does Paul tell him to take a little wine for his stomach? Why doesn't Paul just tell him that he is healed? Why doesn't Paul rebuke him and say, "Oh dear, there's a lack of faith in your, you're lacking in faith, Timothy, or there must be some unconfessed sin in your life. That's why you're getting these frequent bouts of stomach sickness." No, Paul doesn't say that. He says to him, stop drinking only water. Back in the day, they did use wine often for medicinal purposes. He said, stop drinking only water and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. Again, Paul in 2 Timothy 4 verse 20 says this. 2 Timothy 4 verse 20. He says, Erastus stayed in Corinth, and I left Trophimus sick in Miletus. Why didn't Paul just tell Trophimus and Timothy to claim their healing? That's the teaching that's going around today. Claim it in Jesus' name. If you're sick, claim it. If you've any unconfessed sin, dear me, and I'm being a little bit sarcastic here, Paul must have missed that. How come Paul didn't know that? Because it wasn't the way it was done. Sickness had nothing to do in believers' lives. And all of these cases, and there's more, because of unconfessed sin or a lack of faith, nothing could be further from the truth. You would want to be very, very reckless to suggest that any of these individuals and more were sick as a result of their lack of faith or some sin in their lives. We are not even fit to tie their shoelaces. They were people of an amazing spiritual caliber. The Pauls, the Timothys, the Jobs. There's another individual, Job in the Old Testament, and all the rest of them. But some, and again I stress, some, not all, but some sickness comes about as a result of sin and our rebellious ways. In our last message, we heard we reap what we sow, and that still applies. I became sick because of my lifestyle. I brought sickness on myself because I was neglecting myself physically, emotionally, spiritually, and every other way. I neglected every area of my life. And these individuals that we read about today, myself included, had become sick because of their sinful lifestyles. But then, just as we were lying on our deathbed at death's door, and some of us were there at death's door, came the prayer from dry and cracked lips. Hardly able, loathing all food, our lips were cracked, our lips were dry, our bodies were in tatters, physically speaking. But we read in verse 19, then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He sent out his word and healed them. He rescued them from the grave. I don't know about you, but he rescued me from the grave. I was at grave's death's door. And the Bible tells us that the Lord delights in preserving and keeping his children. He delights in preserving them and keeping them, and he delights in restoring them. This is what he does. This is what he has always done. So knowing all of that, and having looked at our plight, having looked at our prayer, having looked at our problem, and having looked at our preservation, what comes next? What comes next? What happens when all is said and done? Verse 21, let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. Let them sacrifice thank offerings and tell of his works with songs of joy. That is what we do. I cried out to the Lord with dry and cracked lips on the 3rd of September 1989. I felt I was at death's door. I felt I was going down, never to return. I was lying on my deathbed, spiritually speaking, and I cried out to him in all of my distress. And friends, as you know, and some of you have experienced this, he rescued me, and he has rescued some of you from the grave. And what he has done for me, and what he has done for many of you listening today, he is more than able to do for others. And you might be in this position. You might feel as though you're lying on your deathbed, spiritually speaking. Again, I want to encourage you today. Cry out, no matter how weak you are, even if it's only 3 words. You know, the shortest prayer in the Bible was prayed by Peter, one of the disciples, when he walked on water. He started to go down. 3 simple words: Lord, save me. And I want to encourage you to cry out to him. Ask him to save you. Tell him the state you're in. He already knows, but tell him, Lord, I'm dying. Lord, I can't take any more of this. Lord, I feel as though I am at death's door. I've nowhere else to go. I'm weary, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, I'm drained. My body is weak. I'm wrecked physically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally. Lord, save me. Call out to him. And friends, I promise you, he will do the rest. He still delights in rescuing and delivering people, even those lying and languishing on their deathbeds. I want to thank you again for taking the time to listen today, and God willing, we'll be with you again next week. The Lord bless you.